our way of interacting with the world, and I'm not talking about in this sense the virus itself, but when we were locked down, when we were changing how we interacted, the sudden shift to e-commerce, and not just a shift, but a shift to very different things like whether something was in stock, whether we could do curbside pickup, dramatically changed search results because the behavior of the entire world changed within the space of a few weeks. And Google also had to immediately react to that and change how they surface things and change what they valued. And so it was interesting to see this thing that there was certainly an algorithmic aspect in play. Google had to do a lot of work and a lot of coding and a lot of reaction. But search results changed because the whole world suddenly changed.
Hello and welcome to Marketing Speak. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. It is my pleasure to have Dr. Peter J. Meyers with us, also known as Dr. Pete. He's the Principal Innovation Architect at Moz, where he works with the marketing and data science teams on product research and data-driven content. Dr. Pete, it's so great to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so you've been at Moz for many, many years. You've been there since it was called SEO Moz, I think, right?
I have. I was involved with the community back to 2007, I think, and then was part-time and full-time contractor and then employee. And so it's hard to LinkedIn, whatever LinkedIn says is wrong. But yeah, more than 15 years in one way, shape, or form.
Wow, that's amazing. So how did you meet Rand Fishkin, the founder of Moz?
I believe I saw him at SES Chicago in 2006. I had a client who was kind of I had dabbled in the late 90s. I was at a startup, and some clients were, why aren't we ranking on this or that? I think it was Yahoo and Northern Light at the time the clients were complaining about. And we kind of went into the app mode, and I got out of the business a little bit. And then I had a client around 2006 say, hey, we want to spend more time on this, and there's a conference in Chicago, we'll send you. And I saw Rand there, and I think I saw some of the folks who used to be at CreatePiece, at Kim Crossberg, and some of those folks, been around a long time. I kind of was impressed by how much had changed in the 6-7 years, how much more sort of user-friendly things have become. Some of the gamification, the late 90s, where it really was keyword stuffing and day-to-day tweaking to see what they had changed that week, and things had changed a lot, and it kind of changed my attitude towards things, and I got back involved again. So
yeah, I remember those days. Web position gold, 7 or 8 different search engines to optimize for. Yeah, it was the Wild West.
Yeah.
So how did you end up becoming this amazing researcher and creating all these data-driven studies and everything like that? That's an area of specialty, it seems like, for you, and that's not common in the SEO industry. A lot of people are just optimizing on page elements, or they're doing more technical things. They're going through and doing audits and things like that. But you have a real specialty. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think my background. So I was a coder since about age 9 or 10. I had a TRS-80 killer computer. I think was my first intro, and then I through college, but I took an interest in psychology in college, and my PhD's in technically in human experimental psychology, but essentially in research psychology. So I have a research science background. I worked in with the medical school a bit back then too. Doing some medical research. So it's always been there for me. When I left grad school, when I finished, I went to work for a brand new startup, the usual mid-90s ISP, ASP story, trying to do everything. But when I got back into SEO and was writing again and was kind of figuring things out and starting over, it was a good time to kind of bring that back to bear. And that was always something, discovery is always something I enjoyed, tracking things in a new way, measuring things in a new way. And so MozCast originally, when we were playing around with that idea, was just this concept of, hey, Google tells us, and at the time, we were tracking maybe a dozen algorithm changes a year or 10, whatever we would name, which was a handful. And then I think it was this long version of the story, but Eric Schmidt testified to Congress and said there were something like 600 changes that year. And I kind of went, what? How come we've named 8 and there are 600 and what's happening? And, we built this prototype of like 100 keywords or something. And Penguin hit, and we kind of saw it happen in real time. And that's just that kind of thing is really fascinating to me. And so I was able to bring that back into bear and bring that spirit of experimentation in. And, it's been rewarding to me to see that the industry has not only embraced, my work in that sense, but really has dabbled and learned to do that better and matured and become better with experimentation and understanding the difference between kind of research and anecdote. And now we see these really big data-driven studies and people looking at millions of keywords. And so, yeah, that's been a cool evolution. But that was kind of always a fit to my background and my personality. And I was glad to be able to find an audience for that, to be sure, and lucky too.
What study that you did or spearheaded is the one you're most proud of?
Oh, that's tough. Some of the ones that don't get much attention, some of the ones that have probably flopped in terms of audience. I was looking a while back at the pattern of how Google applies changes, because we tend to look at the daily changes, and we look at updates and the pattern they happen. And I had heard all these resources about Google having these meetings roughly every 2 weeks back then. And, obviously they're not changing things every day, every hour. They go on vacation and have weekends and things too. And so there was this talk about how, well, like every couple of weeks they have this meeting, they all sit down, they figure out what's going to get patched, what's going to get rolled out, and did some work around trying to find that pattern was there. And we did kind of find that bi-weekly pattern was happening at the time. So sometimes it's just in the weeds, nerdy stuff like that I enjoy. But then we have to figure out, well, do people get that? Is that actionable? Is that important? Recently, I've been behind a lot of the work with Moz on brand authority. And, that's been fun for me because truthfully, that was one of those really simple kind of prototype concepts. And the concept was sort of, hey, if we are pretty good at looking at brand signals on a SERP, understanding what is a branded search, which goes well beyond just the name of a company. It can be products and services, it can be all kinds of things. And if we're pretty good at search volume and understanding that, what happens if we put that together? And that was kind of like the core of brand authority. It wasn't some fancy machine learning model, and we weren't using LLMs and all these things, and nothing against any of that. But we had this kind of simple concept of if we could really understand the volume of branded search for any given domain, what does that tell us? And that's turned out to be, it's funny because sometimes I get into these things that we are able to measure and we launch and we play with, and then we go, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what this is for yet. I don't know how to action on this. You can tell people like, be a bigger brand. Okay, yeah, sure. That's good advice. How do I do that? And so it's launched this whole journey of trying to understand how brands change, how they evolve, how we see keywords. It was really fascinating to me when OpenAI launched. My SEO mindset still of so-called like head keywords, these things I want to compete for that get millions of visits, whatever they are, maybe it's AI or chatbot. And then I started to dig into OpenAI, and terms like ChatGPT were dwarfing any head term they ranked for. And they had essentially created traffic out of nothing. And we're instantly ranking number one for it. And we're instantly in that branded click-through space, which is, double roughly at number one what standard keywords are. And so just to see that to rethink what brand is and what its impact is. And there's some recent studies, ran at SparkToro, and Ahrefs did a follow-up on this, looking at the volume of branded searches compared to all other searches. And then it's, nearing 50%. That it's just a massive piece of people going to Google to look for something specific. And this idea that search starts in the mind of the person who comes to that box, and what they've already heard about, what they're already looking for, what they've already been told about by their friends, what they've seen in an ad or seen on the shelf. Or seen driving around their neighborhood, no matter what it is. And so that's been a really interesting journey for me. That's such a simple metric at first. It's a little more complex now. Can spin out these explorations of things we've never really looked at. And so
Yeah.
that's fun for me. Sometimes I got to bring it back down to earth for sure.
So domain authority is kind of that DA score was something that one of the many things that put Moz on the map, right? And so brand authority, do you see that being similarly important, or is it just another kind of metric to track?
I think it reflects for us where Google is headed. And I won't say that links have gone away by any stretch, but as they migrate towards this idea of entities, of brands, of these things that we know exist in the world and the power and relationship that those things have, and away from the link graph, that we're trying to track that migration with it. And I think now with the LLM space, it's probably even more important. When we look at what an LLM is, it's essentially a collection of everything people have written about, everything people have talked about. What do people write and talk about? They write and talk about brands. They write and talk about entities. And so I think that's the direction we're moving, and it's meant to reflect that. And that duality is still there in search. I think links are still incredibly important, and I think current domain authority, not the original, reflects sort of the ranking power of a site, which is a little broader than links, of course. But I think there is a duality and a balance there that we're trying to measure. And it's interesting. We saw last year with the site reputation abuse update, brand goes too far sometimes, right? Sometimes people capitalize on brand and capitalize on authority in ways that are abusive, or, that maybe just push the envelope. And, that's what we do. We push the envelope a little bit. And so Google's always trying to balance that thing that, hey, you know what? Brands are a thing that exist in the real world and are incredibly important to people, right or wrong. And, a lot of money behind that and other forces. But you can't just ignore that. And so, how do we balance that against these other factors, and making sure that there's diversity in search, and making sure that good content that's maybe written by a small brand or someone you haven't heard of can surface. And so, yeah, I think it's looking at that journey down a couple of years from now and trying to figure out where we'll be, trying to figure out how that helps our customers now, which is also a challenge and important to us too.
So what are some actionable things for somebody who discovers by using the Moz tool that their brand authority score is pretty low?
That's where it gets hard because building a brand is not a technical SEO trick or a tip. I think, it is in some sense an appeal to a mindset of broader marketing, getting away from hyper targeting on SEO, especially as content marketers. We're seeing that now. We're seeing sites that have kind of tried to push their domain authority too hard, tried to push that link profile too hard and go, we're going to write about everything and anything. We're going to get out of our expertise. This all ties to that kind of EAT concept, right? And so I think building some of that, not relying on sort of the tips and tricks, but building your topical authority, being known for something, that's a broader thing than SEO and still a fundamental aspect of marketing. What I'd say to a lot of smaller brands is I think, you're not competing like anything. If you have a corner restaurant, you're not competing against every restaurant in the world. You're not competing against every brand in the world per se. So there are still niches to target. There are still ways you can be known in a smaller space. I think it's really interesting that some brands have done a great job, and now they're very large, but NVIDIA is a great example. They've done a great job of branding their chips. People don't look for graphics chips or, they're searching for very specific chips and cards, and they've gotten to know those as individual brands beyond the company itself. And I start to see companies who are getting smart with sort of piggybacking the brand into product-specific brands and the service-specific brands. And even from a content standpoint, I think it was Apple who has a great section on their site for people looking to switch from PCs. And I'm a Windows guy. So
no.
I'm not, I don't, for the most part, I have iPads, which is a weird mix, but I have Android, Windows iPads, and we get confused. But I think it's interesting, like they've seen that people saying, hey, what's Apple all about? Or I'm having trouble with Windows, or what do I want to do? And so they've kind of targeted that top of funnel content and almost made it a branded thing that, Apple is giving you those answers, right? And it's not coming from a generic site. And then, hey, what happens next? What am I going to buy, or who am I going to trust? And so it all ties into that authority and trust aspect that I think we can all start building, and is important in the world, right? Too, it's important to people, it's important to customers, and so it's a good thing to build towards. It doesn't mean we need to be OpenAI, or we need to be an Apple. That's not going to happen. That's okay, but we can start.
Yeah. What about personal brand authority? Like, let's take you as an example. You're out in the SEO world as Dr. Pete, and people know you as Dr. Pete. So you have a personal brand website and so forth. How are you building that brand authority personally?
Yeah. So first of all, don't go to my personal site. Like many people, it's been neglected for far too long. There is some clear dumb luck involved in that. I'll be totally honest. It was funny when I was at my own company. There weren't a lot of people in the industry I was in with PhDs, and people would see it. I don't make a big issue out of it. I was never much for academic snobbery. It's probably part of what got me out of academia, honestly. But it was on my card, and I had clients who just started to call me Dr. Pete, and that became second nature for me. And yeah, adapting that was probably one of the smartest things I've ever done, because that certainly helped. And my name is fairly generic, so it's always good to stand out a bit. I think it was this. I am not someone who likes to focus on one thing, and so I think an important lesson for me with personal branding was to maybe not restrict myself to one topic area, but to start to at least develop from a core of this kind of a certain kind of SEO research, things like SERP tracking back in the days, tracking SERP features when they rolled out, some of the stuff other folks like Barry Schwartz have done for years, but to try and kind of build into that niche. And that was something I sort of resisted, because my interests are all over the place. But I think niching in a sense was a really important part of building that personal brand. I think I was lucky in a sense too, that Moz community, when we had UMoz and we had community posts, and when the blog comments were active, which, now that's just a whole different world. Unfortunately, like forums and blog comments are kind of, quality issues really sprung up and spam really sprung up. But back then, a lot of those folks who were just starting out around the same time are now the owners of agencies and SEO tools, and have gone on to do a lot of things. And to be able to kind of be a part of that network early on, I was really lucky. And I say that to kind of younger SEOs sometimes, people who I think on social media we tend to try and follow the influencers and kind of get their attention, And for me, I was so lucky to be able to be with a cohort of people who were also starting out, who have now achieved things, and to now be friends with the influencers because I was there with them when they weren't influencers. And I see that, it's something I kind of want to say to the younger folks in SEO, those people that you're with now that are just starting out, that are just building their own shops or independent consultants, they're going to be the influencers in 10 years, and so instead of chasing the rest of us, I'm 55 this year, going 54, going on 55, we won't be at this forever, but the folks who are just starting out now, they're going to be the next generation of influencers and agency owners and startup people, and the ones kind of making things happen. So be a part of that, that's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. And also there are a lot of naysayers out there that say SEO is finally for real going to die now.
Finally.
Yeah. So what do you say to them?
I take a broad view. If you look at the entire world of things that need to be found and people who need to find them, then there will always be search engines in some way, shape, or form. And as long as there are search engines, there will always be some way to do better on them and to optimize for them. And I think that can be a symbiotic thing, right? Those engines need us to craft information that's useful and present it in a way that they can ingest, and all these things. I think with the LLM aspect and with Gemini and so on, what Google's doing, there's maybe legitimate questions of not only who owns content and how do we define plagiarism and things like that, but of what's in it for me? What's the balance between Google's revenue and webmasters? What if I'm not getting traffic anymore? I think those are all legitimate questions that impact the future of SEO as we do it now. But if SEO is just helping people find the things they want to find, we're always going to need that. And as information continues to grow, the scope of information in the world is not going to get less. It's not going to decelerate. So there will always be a need to manage that information and figure out how to find things within that space. Which is not to say that our jobs will not be changing, to be sure.
But in this fast changing world with AI and SEO and so forth, maybe having a big textbook on SEO isn't the smartest thing now.
Well, I still appreciate that you've written it and keep it up to date. And I think it's good that I think sometimes people kind of, we make fun of like certain SEO classes and things. I think they're getting a lot better, and people go, oh, well, it moves so fast. But there is still a core of information that people need, will always need. It's funny for me with Moz. I met a journalism professor on a plane in Chicago who had just read the Beginner's Guide to SEO. We just got chatting, asked me who I worked for. I worked for Moz. Oh my God, I just read, no association with SEO whatsoever. We weren't in Seattle. We weren't leaving MozCon. And it's interesting to me that I think we sometimes undervalue the things that reach the world outside of SEO.
Yeah.
And those core resources and some of that, if I look at things like the Beginner's Guide, that's such a fundamental part of building Moz and outreach to the rest of the world who doesn't know what we do or doesn't even really know what Google is all about, doesn't know the difference between a browser and a search engine sometimes. As we provide tech support for our families and things like that. So I think sometimes we take that really narrow view of the latest and greatest, and the rest of the world needs to kind of know what this is all about and be communicated to and have these resources. So I think there's still a lot of value in that.
No, like it is a big investment in time each edition. So we're on the 4th edition now, and it was like 2 years each go around. It's crazy.
Yeah, I even updating some blog posts. I'm working on my annual. We did the 10-year Google history last year, based on the kind of the warming graph of is the search heating up and all these things, which is a big project every time. And this year I'm like, well, do we do 11 years? Do we stop at 10? And the content team was like, no, we really need to do it, update it every year and do the 11 years. Like, okay. I guess it's one of those, it's close to my heart. And then yet I remember all the work it took last time. And I go, all right, let's get to work. Let's get it done.
Yeah.
Because people still value it. So
what would be actionable out of a big report like that?
I think that's a little different kind of animal. I think what's interesting about that 10-year chart we did of kind of the temperature of Google algorithm churn is just understanding it has heated up, right? There is more. I did a content churn analysis recently. More content is being produced. There is more overturn in SERPs. There is more need for freshness even outside of news. And so I think sometimes it's just good to see that big picture. I think the idea, people always say like, well, we can't worry about what the algorithm does every day. But what's funny to me, like when I launched MozCast and for the decade or so since then, is that the thing that people say to me is just, it's good to know I'm not crazy. It's good to know it's not just me, but these things are happening across SERPs. These things are happening across Google. And to know when it is something I did and when it's not something I did, and maybe it's something beyond my control, even that's okay. But just to be aware that this is happening out there, I think it's been really interesting too to look at that historical scope of 10, 11 years and start to see the things that impact search that are not Google algorithm updates. So COVID being a great example, there's massive search churn in the few months after COVID because our way of interacting with the world, and I'm not talking about in this sense the virus itself, but when we were locked down, when we were changing how we interacted, the sudden shift to e-commerce, and not just a shift, but a shift to very different things like whether something was in stock, whether we could do curbside pickup, dramatically changed search results because the behavior of the entire world changed within the space of a few weeks. And Google also had to immediately react to that and change how they surface things and change what they valued. And so it was interesting to see this thing that there was certainly an algorithmic aspect in play. Google had to do a lot of work and a lot of coding and a lot of reaction. But search results changed because the whole world suddenly changed. And so that's really interesting to me to look at some of those patterns and go, this is sociology too. This is the sum total of the world and our behavior and our knowledge and our shifts that changes the web every day. That's not just the algorithm. And as you start to track keywords over time, and you think about daily or weekly rankings or whatever it is, from an SEO perspective, I don't have to know what's happening every 5 minutes. But if you start to dig into some of these keywords and you realize where they change, rankings are changing every time you reload. This is a real, I don't think we always appreciate what a real-time phenomena search rankings really are. There's not some database. We know that. We know that there's not some database that says this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. That's how it's going to be for all of January. But I don't think we always grasp how real time it really is. How much this thing is being delivered on the fly with massive resource and processing power based on what's happened in the last 5 minutes and what's been published in the last, sometimes when that's relevant. And so, that we get it in the back of our heads, but until you watch it every day for a decade, I don't think you really get it. So it's changed my perspective in a lot of ways. And I think that has a ton of value. I don't think you look at a 10-year history and go, this is what I do this week for SEO. That's not the goal. But I think perspective is important.
Yeah, I agree. And do you think that Google's search result quality has gone down in recent years? I know there are some SEOs that have been quite vocal about that, like Lily Ray. Do you see it as a downward, maybe not spiral, but trend?
I have mixed feelings. Yes, in some ways. I think it's hard to separate. I think the quality of the web overall has gone down.
Yeah.
There has been kind of a content arms race, and that content arms race has degraded the average quality of content, I would say.
Yeah, well, we've been inundated with AI generated content. Like one study I read was like 57% of the internet is AI generated, and much of it was just translation.
Yeah, and we've seen, I think that's meant Google has had to react faster, and reacting faster isn't a great thing sometimes. It's led to a more reactionary stance, and that can harm things. It was interesting when I studied even the first Penguin update to see that when you have an actual penalty, like a punitive action saying we're going to hit these sites for doing a thing we think is bad, often what's underneath those sites is also bad. Now, it's maybe bad for different reasons, but a lot of times when they knocked out the sites doing bad things, the sites underneath them weren't great either, and that content quality. And so I think sometimes when Google has to do this kind of reactionary stuff, it doesn't go great. I do worry the rush to LLMs naturally captured people's imagination. I get that. They did for me in a lot of ways as well. But when Google saw what Bing and OpenAI were doing and decided we have to accelerate all our plans, even though it was pretty clear Google didn't want to do that.
And they weren't ready for it.
And they weren't, no. And I don't think there's so much to search that isn't really handled by LLMs. It's great at natural language, it's great at kind of aggregation, but there's so many aspects of search that Google does well that aren't reflected in that. So I do worry about that. That's gone too far, too fast. It has the appearance of validity, And, more and more I see things where I go, oh, hey, it gave me an answer. And then I realize it gave me the answer it thought I wanted, which isn't really turning out to be quite in sync with reality. And even little things. I'm doing some painting around the house, some touch up, and anybody who's done touch up painting, my house is not old, but 2000 or so. Touch up painting on 20-year-old walls. You're never happy, and it never is what you want it to be. And you're always like, oh, what can I do? What's the trick? And I've been asking Google some very specific questions, and it's very encouraging. Kind of like ChatGPT, where it'll go, oh yeah, just do this and this and this. Like, oh, hold on. I know where that's going to go, but that was the aggregate of all the knowledge it found with what it thinks I want to hear, and that's scary, and that's a little dangerous.
Yeah.
I think Google certainly, one of my concerns with mobile. When Google started to see that mobile was hurting their ad revenue, I think it changed, and they started to go mobile first, and I get that, and I think that makes sense. And certainly, we're on a much more diverse set of devices, all of us, even at my age, than we used to be. We're not doing everything from the desktop PC. But when it started to become about those metrics, and obviously it is about revenue, that doesn't always align with quality. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. It was really interesting to me with tracking some things with MozCast, where when Google reps would still talk to me now and then about some of the insights. Some of them still talk to me, but talking about they got some data from us, and I was like, I'm really surprised you don't measure that. And the answer was more or less, well, that's not a metric we value. It's not that we can't. We certainly could measure that, but that's not something that moves the needle for us. And so understanding how Google views quality, which isn't purely financial, but certainly has a very heavy financial aspect and a very heavy connection to the ad ecosystem, which is not to say that rankings are driven by ad spending, but just to say that Google's view of success is naturally flavored by the ad ecosystem, that they don't measure things the same way we do. They don't view quality quite the same way we do. And accepting that is kind of an important part of the journey. It's hard to say right or wrong on some of that, but there are certainly incentives on Google's side that don't always align with maximizing the quality of the results.
And the downside potential is so much greater when we're talking about YMYL categories, your money or your life. Touch-up painting, that's one thing, but
right.
Surgery and chronic diseases and investment advice and so forth, where it's just giving you an answer it thinks you're going to want to hear, that's dangerous.
I really thought they would stay out of those spaces with Gemini, and they have not, and that is a little scary. Like how much you're relying on LMs for some of that information. That really worries me. Yeah. And it's hard too, because that's a very profitable content space. And our, full disclosure is Ziff Davis, we have Everyday Health, and we have brands in that space that try and do good work, but that's an extremely competitive and lucrative space. And so, yeah, there's a lot of pressures there, and a lot of, unfortunately, grifts and outright scams, and a lot of money there too. So yeah, the pressures on that are scary, but I thought they would steer clear of it for quite a while. And it is amazing how many YMYL, straight up healthcare and finance kind of queries you will get AI results for, and some of them are fine, but like you say, if I mix the paint wrong, I just have to start over, unless I poison myself or something, I guess. But yeah, you get bad medical advice or bad financial advice, and that's a whole different world.
Yeah, interesting times. What do you think about last month's Google updates? Was that kind of reactionary and trying to fix something and then breaking it even more, or do you see that as a net positive move?
Boy, it's hard. I felt like we are obviously in the content space pretty sensitive to the site reputation update stuff on sort of the back and forth on some of that. And so it's been hard to separate the site reputation abuse manual actions from some of the other updates they've done. It does feel like some of that was personal, uh, when Forbes, I think it was, kind of got called out again. Google felt like they had to take action. And, I think people who've been in the space a long time like us know that sometimes Google is people and Google takes things personally. And sometimes they do these things that are kind of like, okay, you've pushed too hard, too far. Uh, and there's kind of a backlash. I felt that was really broad. I feel like the communications have been really poor. It's been justified, kind of post justified, instead of saying, hey, you know what, this went too far and we cracked down on these brands, trying to say almost in an algorithmic sense what they did. I don't think that's quite sincere. I think they're trying to kind of post hoc justify what they did and then sort of craft the algorithm around it and then adjust around those statements. And so there's a weird PR aspect to that. I think it went a little too far too fast, and they're going to have to rebalance. I don't. I also think, on the other hand, there have brands who have benefited from low quality practices for a long time and made their money, and so it's a little disingenuous to cry crocodile tears when you've made millions of dollars for years doing these things, and like, hey, you might have to regroup. But I do know good brands who are genuinely kind of worried that and overreacting and maybe going in bad directions because now they're so fearful of things being shut down overnight.
Yeah.
I do think Google's virtual monopoly in the US, I know legally, well, I guess legally now they essentially have called it a monopoly, with the hearings last year, and that'll get rewritten under a new administration probably. But yeah, it's not great for anyone. The power Google has over our sites is massive. And LLMs are shaking that up in ways that, maybe are good and maybe are bad. But I don't know that they always wield that responsibly. And I don't know that anyone can at that dollar value. So it would be nice to see us using more than one search engine again one of these days. I think that would be good for everyone, but it's hard to see how someone breaks into that space easily in 2025. The spending involved and the infrastructure. I mean, we don't think about what it means to build a data center. These cities that Google has built with their own power plants and their own water supplies, and how someone breaks into that.
Yeah, it's crazy. So the industries you think might be most in Google's crosshairs would be what? Like affiliates? Do you think law firms? Do you think e-commerce? Do you think like what sort of industries should be really worried about this?
I mean, I see content brands across multiple industries who are concerned just because they feel like, hey, we've tried to branch out a little bit. We aren't necessarily in a tightly super constrained topic area, and should we be worried about that? And I worry about Google's messaging basically saying, well, you shouldn't be using freelancers, you shouldn't be using outside writers. Boy, I feel like writers, I know a lot of writers, they have a rough time as it is. Now we're basically saying, don't hire anybody outside your own company. Well, why? What's wrong with that inherently if quality is good? And so I'm worried across the board. I always worried about spaces that Google could get into themselves. That's always been hard for travel. That's been hard for credit cards. Lyrics, obviously, is a great example. Anytime Google could wake up the next day and just take over that space, is a scary space to be. I think there's still a certain symbiosis with local businesses and with things that drive ad revenue that, Google, there's a push and pull. Google starts to take over. They pushed hard into automotive, for example, and into like car sales. And I think they got a heavy amount of pushback because, you've got all these, not just big brands, but all these local dealerships and people trying to sell cars and going, hey, that's not for you to step in and be the front plate of all of that or be the aggregator of all of that. That's our world. And so there's been push and pull, which is good. I think there are other times when it's okay, and it's always hard for me. I look at local SEO sometimes, and people get upset because their website's been pushed down, right? It used to be that the local pack, you go right to the website, and now the local pack goes to the map pack, and the map pack might go to the website, and you're kind of 3 stages down. And I look at it and go, I get it as marketers, that's scary, but if I'm a local restaurant, and like me so often, I'm in my car with my phone looking for something near where I am, I don't care if I go to your website, and you shouldn't care either. You should care that I know when you're open, what you serve. I see your ratings, I see your address, and I go to your restaurant. That's the mark of success, right? Not whether I view the pictures of your dog on the website and read the PDF of your menu that's 9,000K. And so I not to be a little dismissive or rude, but I do think there's a point where sometimes we go, okay, that's still, the end goals are still aligned, right? I still want people to know when I'm open and where I'm at and to walk into my store. And if Google is serving that, it's okay to evolve with that. But if Google starts to take over spaces and give nothing back, am I real upset about lyrics? Well, let's say some of those sites weren't the greatest in the world. But do travel agencies all deserve to stop doing business because Google can aggregate all that data? Well, who'd they get that data from? What value? Same with LLMs, right? That's our stuff that you're using to make money. And we have to figure out in our economic system how that works. What do we get back? And I do think the balance with the webmasters has shifted, right? We're not getting as much back as we used to. We're still giving everything away. And I don't think that can last. I think there's a revolution of sorts brewing there. And I worry about that for anyone in the content space, regardless of industry.
Doesn't feel to me like Google really values the websites. That it's really the advertisers. And if somebody is not advertising, but they have a website that relies on Google for their lead flow or their e-commerce, then there's really no loyalty or much interest in from Google's perspective. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my feeling about it.
I think at best, there's an abstraction over time that as the engine separates from the content, of not appreciating how you got there, and it's like the housing crisis, mortgage-backed equities. We went from individual homes to be able to buy a financial vehicle that represented thousands of homes. And at some point, there's an abstraction that's too much, right? That separates us. And I think there's a lack of appreciation for what did you build this on, and it's true with LLMs too. Like, whose content did you build this on? Whether or not you're plagiarizing or quoting it or stealing it is a complicated question. But at the end of the day, you still built your empire on our land. And what is that? What is the obligation? What is the responsibility there? I guess that's an age-old question if you phrase it that way.
It's a big question.
We don't do a great job of it, economically speaking. So I think that has to be asked. What is in it for webmasters? What is in it for content producers? And if you decouple it too much, and the search results no longer really have that transactional element for the rest of us, why do we bother? Why don't we just robots.txt block our whole site, other than fear of loss of revenue? But if I don't have any anyway, if I'm not getting transactions no matter what, why do I keep giving you my blood, sweat, and tears? It's a hard question, and I think more people are going to be asking that.
Yeah. What do you think are the ranking signals that really move the needle these days? The ranking factors? Yeah,
I think they're just so much more niche than they used to be. It really depends what areas you're in and the quality of the area you're in and what kind of content mix there is and what kind of brand mix there is. I do think brands and entities have that level of influence has expanded, maybe even to a fault. That there's almost a default view of, hey, if we don't know what to rank, give it to the big player, give it to a known brand, give it to a trusted source. That's probably almost tipped a little too far. I think uh, topicality has shifted really hard. Google's really gone towards wanting to see these sort of highly topic focused sites. And again, that's almost gotten abused. People are kind of creating topicality just for the sake of ranking, and that's kind of come up with some updates. That's gotten more important, but maybe too important. I think timeliness has gotten maybe too important, that we don't appreciate, the rewarding recency more than kind of evergreen. Obviously, that depends a lot on your niche. And so it's hard because I see these trends and then I go, but I don't know if they're good, and I don't know if they're going to reverse. It's hard with LLMs because you don't see ranking factors in the same way, right? You see an aggregate view of everything. And so I think Google realized right away that having some kind of source attribution wasn't just something people were pushing for, but it was a way of them knowing, is this coming from a place of quality? Because if it's coming from an aggregate of everything, quality is kind of diffuse now, right? Like what is a ranking factor for any given site if you're aggregating the whole world? And so that's going to be interesting to me. How do those factors apply? Right now, they're just a layer, right? You do all the LLM stuff and then you throw your ranking factors at it when you're done. But what does quality look like for an LLM kind of engine? There's still no metric of accuracy, truthfulness, reality, adjacency. How does this information reflect reality, objective reality as best we know? We still have not beaten that. So yeah, it's tough.
Do you remember the Colbert Report skit on, or not skit, but a little piece on truthiness?
Oh, truthiness, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that seeming, like a joke at first.
Now it's become the thing.
Now that feels like a real thing. Yeah. And it's a little scary.
It went from word of the year to reality. Yeah, the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Like it or not, yeah, we do for sure.
Yeah. So you're a scientist. You love applying the scientific method to things like figuring out what ranking signals are actually working these days and which ones are kind of red herrings or hot air. So what are some interesting things that our listener or viewer may not know about that you maybe discovered through experimentation, through having a hypothesis and then testing it?
It's tough to experiment at that scale with Google. I've seen people do some interesting things with kind of massive split testing across really large sites. That's half the pages are going to do this and half the pages are going to do this. They're all product pages. We're going to see what happens. And it's been interesting. I know Search Pilot, the former Distilled folks are doing some interesting stuff. And it's funny that, what they find really varies a lot with the customer and the niche and kind of the ranking factors within that vertical. And, the days I've worked in usability, but I've never been one of those folks who've been like, oh, I made the button red and conversion went up, so everybody make your buttons red. Because it just almost never works, right? It almost never pans out, or you miss something. I think some interesting stuff. Tom Capper, who I work for, had a study earlier this year looking at how brand authority might be in play, and this came out of the Google leaks. And what was interesting, what we found essentially was that sites with higher brand awareness were essentially being cushioned from certain updates. In this case, helpful content update more than other sites. And what specifically was looking at was kind of the domain authority, brand authority association, essentially saying that if your signals aren't aligned, if you have too many links, too much topical authority, too much domain authority for your brand, and your brand doesn't seem to merit it, if that ratio is out of whack, you're going to tend to do worse. Those sites tend to get hit harder because, and I think this has always been true to some extent, but gets more true over time, is that signal alignment becomes important. We started to see it with social media when it was easier to measure, where people's social signals would get way out of whack of their link signals, and I'd see Google start to hit them, basically go, this doesn't make sense. If one signal is way out of whack, you're gaming the system, right? Because if you're a big brand, if you're well known, if you're getting a lot of mentions, you're probably also getting links, right? You're probably also getting search volume. These things kind of all move together. And if they start to move separately, you're probably cheating. You're probably doing something. And so that's interesting to me because I think that's always kind of been there, that signal, building your signals together is really important because that's what a real brand looks like. Where one being completely out of place, that's when you're probably gaming things. I wonder if we'll get into that with LLMs, with people trying to game the way LLMs work, which is hard but possible. And then Google going, yeah, okay, you played by the rules of the machine, but nobody searches for you, nobody knows about you, nobody's linked to you, nobody mentions you in social. Something's up here. And so I think that is going to evolve over time. It gets really interesting. But it's been interesting to see how brand might be represented and how it might come down to how many people are looking for you, and does that match up with kind of your other signals, or nobody's heard of you but you have all these links, something's up. So that's a really interesting area for me, but it gets complicated.
Is link building still a thing to focus on in these days of SEO?
I mean, I think that link building that drives traffic, absolutely. I think the interconnectedness of the web is still extremely important. And so, yeah, linking to things that are relevant, cross-linking within your site well, linking out to things that matter still is valuable to the web ecosystem and is valuable to Google. I don't know that building links for the sake of building links, I think that's doesn't work as well as it once did. I've never been a link builder per se, though. So I've always been a little biased about how we do that. I also think sometimes, it's funny to measure things because we build a big, or even get a big link legitimately, big mention or big press mention, and we kind of expect rankings to move overnight, and they really don't, right? It's not that simple and it's not that fast. And to kind of watch the time lapse of how rankings change based on what we do, it's often longer than we think. It takes more buildup than we think, and Google doesn't react to us personally overnight or go, oh, they're great now. That can happen overnight. It's extremely rare.
It's over months, many months usually.
Yeah, especially in the link building area, and it's a critical mass. It's a movement. It's not one link.
And you have to have corroborating factors, I think, too. Like you said, if you're not also building unlinked mentions and other kinds of brand awareness, then it looks out of whack.
Well, it often doesn't last, right? You have that spike and you do a lot of link building, and then for the next 6 months, nothing's happening. And, that looks unnatural. It is unnatural in a sense. I mean,
yeah, that's why looking at multiple link building factors, not just at the domain authority, domain rating, or whatever, but also things like link velocity and so forth is important.
Yeah, because they reflect the way things actually build. Things that grow organically. That's how they look, right? That's the profile they're trying to find.
Yeah. So we shouldn't try to make it look natural. We should actually make it natural.
Harder said than done. Yes, we should.
Yes, better said, easier said than done. Yeah.
Not put on the cloak of naturality, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah. Well, I know we're at time here, so what would be one last nugget of wisdom that you'd like to share with our listener?
Oh, I'd say, as always, just be a searcher yourself. We've got to all be out there and see what's happening and use the engines and understand our own spaces, because I think things are getting not just vertical, but getting more and more niche, more and more personalized in some ways, more and more localized. And so we have to understand what people are coming to find for our brand, and not look at it as one giant space. It's all the same. So be aware and be a searcher, and be where your customers are, as always.
Yeah. They're actually, like the undercover boss type mystery shoppers who will pretend to be a customer and call in and find out that their customer support team is terrible or whatever the thing is. Yeah, that their website doesn't work or whatever. Yeah, it's important.
We don't always want to know, but you have to. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And how do our listeners learn from you more? How do they? Where do we send them to learn more of your interesting and action-oriented content and studies and so forth?
Yeah, it's hard with the social space right now, but I'm still on the Moz blog, of course. I'm on LinkedIn, and I am relatively active on Blue Sky and Threads right now, so you can find me most of those spaces. But hopefully LinkedIn will stay stable for a while, so you can start there and branch out.
Yeah. We'll include links in the show notes. Awesome. So thank you so much, Dr. Pete. And yeah, you're a pillar to the SEO community. And thank you for all that you do.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Yeah. And thank you, listener. Now do something valuable with this information. It's not just edutainment. This is meant for you to action. So make the world a better place. We'll catch you in the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.